a lot. I've said to a couple of people as I arrived that I feel kind of intimidated about speaking here because either you've already heard me say all this at least once and you're going to be kind of tired of it, or you're one of the health and child development experts here who knows way more about elements of this story than I do. But I'm hoping, my assignment was to kind of give you an overview of the social science research on the damage of growing up in a severely distressed neighborhood and the potential benefits of being able to move to a better neighborhood. So I'm hoping that this overview will put sort of everybody on sort of one common understanding for the deeper discussions you're going to have tomorrow. I think everybody just intuitively knows that the neighborhoods in which we live matter to the well-being of our families, to the well-being of our kids. In effect, all middle-class people who agonize with each other about where they're going to move and where they're going to send their kids to school, I mean, we just implicitly know this fact that the community in which we live matters. But there is also a nice, hefty body of social science research that shows that conditions in really severely distressed neighborhoods undermine kids' well-being and their long-term life chances, other things being equal. So, I mean, John really has said this already, but there's tons of literature that does the other things being equal and finds really serious negative consequences of living in these profoundly distressed neighborhoods. And those consequences range from the really early years for preschool kids who've been shown to exhibit more aggressive behaviors when interacting with other little kids, all the way to the teen years and beyond. So this is pretty consistent body of evidence. And as Betsy and Barbara have said, Pat Sharkey's latest book really makes this compelling and kind of heartbreaking case that living in a high poverty neighborhood undermines these outcomes not just for one generation, but across generations. And he puts up a graphic that shows that kids whose parents grew up in high poverty neighborhoods score dramatically worse on reading and problem solving tests than those whose parents grew up in non-poor neighborhoods, other things being equal. So your parents growing up in a distressed neighborhood and you growing up in a distressed neighborhood is this huge double whammy for kids. And I'm not going to repeat the reality that this is an issue of segregation. This is an issue of race. So that's the evidence that there is a problem, and there's also evidence that sort of points to the mechanisms through which those outcomes occur. So I think we have all been reading, either serious or more popularized versions of this evidence pointing more and more to the critical importance of a strong and healthy start in utero, but also those early years of growing up are just critical for lifelong health and development. And the synthesis of that literature that's been taught to me recently is we really need to think about children having these 4 fundamental needs: responsive caregiving, safe and secure environments, adequate and appropriate nutrition, and the chance to develop kind of health-promoting behaviors and habits, including sleep and diet and physical activity. So those are kind of these core needs that every kid has to develop in a healthy way. And I think Susan was making the point, and others have too, that it's really parents who are the central sort of first circle around the child to try to meet those fundamental needs. But to do so, they really have to rely on a set of critical resources. And these are resources that are taxed or undermined for families who are poor. Financial resources, obviously, but time to provide to the kids, psychological health, robustness, resources for the child, and broader sort of human capital resources. So again, every parent draws upon the resources that they have in those domains to try the best they can to meet the needs of their kids. And it's tougher for poor families because in some ways, by definition, one or more of those resources is really constrained for them. But here I'm reiterating John's point. It's even tougher when the neighborhood is undermining the resources of the parent or the efforts of the parent. And we can picture ways in which neighborhood can bolster up families' weak resources or undermine their resources. And I think we are seeing that the neighborhoods of serious isolation and distress that we care about are undermining the parents' resources and therefore undermining their ability to meet these fundamental needs of their kids. And we've, in a lot of ways, we've already touched this evening on what I think now I think of as the three sort of high priority mechanisms. There are other mechanisms that work, and I think every researcher working on neighborhood effects has some different way of grouping and categorizing the mechanisms. But I think we've already talked about the three that are most important from the perspective of kids. This crime and violence issue, the quality and effectiveness of public services in the neighborhoods where schools are the sort of most obvious and important, but not the only one. And then the sort of robustness and the positiveness of the social networks around the kids and their parents. So let me just say a couple more things about each of those mechanisms. So the crime and violence issue is one I think we've recognized for a long time. When I look back at writing that I did with Ingrid Gould Ellen on this topic in the 90s, we listed crime and violence as one of the big mechanisms. And we said it's not just that you're more likely to be the victim yourself of some kind of crime so that you're hurt or killed, but that the exposure to crime is damaging. People were already beginning to say that and have evidence of that in the 90s. I think the evidence around that has clearly just grown tremendously, so that now we're talking about the number of this horrendous number of exposures to violence and crime and trauma, and to essentially the PTSD-like conditions that it generates, and then to the structural, the physiological, and emotional ripple effects that undermine all kinds of other outcomes over the life course. So after talking about that, it almost seems a little almost trivial to say, and also, when you live in a violent neighborhood, you don't go walk around the block, you don't get enough exercise, there's the learning environment in the schools is disrupted, so that all kinds of other negative consequences for children and their parents of living in these violent, disordered, chaotic places. So neighborhoods, I think the mechanism that was at the top of my and Ingrid's list in the 90s was those schools that services that get delivered at the neighborhood level with an emphasis on elementary schools. And I think we obviously, I think in the intervening years, more interventions have begun to break the link between where you live and necessarily where you go to school, but worrying about the horrendous quality of the public schools in many severely distressed neighborhoods is the second mechanism that we can't forget and need to give a lot of attention to. Right behind that comes quality child care and preschool services, access to good medical care, good mental health services, and grocery stores where you can buy healthy food at affordable prices. So the third the third mechanism that I wanted to emphasize in the context of kids is social networks, peer groups. And I don't want to say this in a way to imply that this is culture of poverty or fault of the families and the kids. But again, when we think about where we want to live, we think about, well, so who would be the kids our children are meeting at school? And are they going to be surrounded by other kids and teachers and other families who are going to encourage them and support them and help identify pathways for them to go on and have a terrific life? And in the neighborhoods that have been devastated and isolated by segregation and disinvestment and poverty, those networks may not be supportive of good outcomes for kids or supportive for families in taking care of their kids. I think the reason that you're here today and tomorrow and doing this work is because the big ambitious objective of interrupting sort of this intergenerational cycle of poverty, interrupting kids growing up in places that consign them to a life in poverty and distress. Interrupting that is something that's really a high priority, and you have a tremendous sense of urgency about it. And I think the evidence I see is extremely strong that figuring out how to tackle, how to shift those neighborhood conditions, crime and violence, lousy schools, poor health promoting services and facilities, and social networks, really focusing on those mechanisms is key to the solution. I liked the fact that John and I think others have put on the table that helping people move isn't the only way to tackle those problems and those mechanisms. And I think that it's been too long that the people who are really interested in promoting and experimenting with mobility strategies are seen as being in conflict with or at odds with people who are trying to change those conditions in the neighborhoods. I mean, we really ought to be smart enough to say we should be doing both those things. And some of us will work on one, and some of us will work on another, and some of us will go back and forth. But there's no reason that these kinds of efforts should be seen as somehow being in conflict with each other. This is a meeting that's focusing primarily on the mobility strategy. But I suspect that there are people in the room who are interested in both strategies, or some who may be most interested in the let's see if we can make those neighborhoods better strategy. So the last thing I want to say before I stop is just to say a little bit more about what we know regarding the role that assisted housing mobility strategies can play in the solution. And here I think I'm following up a little bit on some issues that John raised. I want to come back to what is it that the Moving to Opportunity demonstration did, and what have we learned from it. I think I was one of the people that you were talking to in the 1990s and saying you're not paying enough attention to what are the characteristics of the neighborhoods that you hope families will move to, and you're right, you were right. So if there is somehow someone in this room who doesn't know what the Moving to Opportunity demonstration was, it was conducted by HUD, started in the early 90s in 5 metropolitan areas, and its objective really was to evaluate the impact of relocation for poor families from very high poverty neighborhoods to neighborhoods of opportunity, defined in that demonstration as very low poverty neighborhoods. And it was indeed the advocacy around that demonstration and the expectations for it were indeed about economic opportunity for the parents and for the kids, for the next generation. But the rhetoric and the hopes were that the parents would get jobs and earn more and be less poor, and that the kids would do better in school and go on and be economically more successful than their parents. So the HUD-sponsored and foundation-supported decades-long evaluation found that the families that received the experimental treatment, so they got a voucher and counseling to move to a low-poverty neighborhood, they did move to places with significantly lower crime rates. They felt much safer in them. Their housing was better, and their mental health outcomes were better. So those were actually all the things, as Barbara said, they were all the things they said they wanted when asked, why are you making this move? They did not say, we want to move to be closer to a job. They said, we want to get away from the crime and violence. And they did. And the evidence is that they were healthier, both physically and emotionally, as a result. But the evaluation did not find higher employment, higher incomes, or across all these kids, better educational outcomes. So there are many people who say that moving the MTO demonstration proves that neighborhood doesn't matter, or that moving to a better neighborhood doesn't result in better outcomes for families. But in fact, everything we've said so far tonight suggests that those health gains, those violence reductions, and those health gains are hugely important. High rates of obesity and anxiety and depression really degrade a person's quality of life. They, over the long term, degrade their ability to earn a living. And having a depressed mom is a really bad circumstance for a child. So those are really important gains that I think get de-emphasized. But as I said, the lack of outcomes on employment, income, and education have been used to discredit the mobility strategy. So I want to just push a little farther on that because I dug a little deeper into these data. And I think a big reason that the gains that we observed were limited to these health outcomes is that, in fact, the mobility assistance that was provided to these families didn't enable very many of them to spend very much time in really high opportunity neighborhoods. So this is what John predicted in 1992 or something. They did move to better quality housing and safer neighborhoods. And for the most part, they didn't just go whomp back to the same horrible isolation that they started in, so that there were measurable gains on average in the kinds of neighborhoods people lived in. But very few spent more than a year in a neighborhood that was really low poverty, really high employment. Hardly any moved to neighborhoods that had really good schools, and hardly any moved to neighborhoods that were not majority-minority. So I messed around with a little statistical analysis to say, well, how did the outcomes differ depending on how much time you spent in how low a poverty neighborhood? And essentially, the longer time people spent in the lower poverty neighborhoods, the better their outcomes were. And here I found nice, strong, statistically significant effects on employment, earnings, income, and educational outcomes for both boys and girls. And these are statistically significant, but they're also substantial in size. So for example, for a boy who lived in neighborhoods with poverty rates averaging 16% over the course of the demonstration period, their predicted English and math test scores were nearly a year's worth of instruction better than a similar boy who lived in neighborhoods with poverty rates averaging 41%. So the bigger the improvement in neighborhood we got, the bigger bang we got on all the outcomes we cared about. So there's my argument for why this next generation of assisted mobility strategies, which has learned from practice and learned from research, is really the right way to be working.
Well, thank you very much, and I think that that was great, and that I know that I learned a lot from listening to it. I mean, one question before I open it up for comments from everyone else in the audience. I think it's interesting that you stress that the mobility strategy can't be the only strategy, and I think for a lot of reasons that's true, including just for discussing it publicly. But are there examples where instead of having people move to opportunity, where you have opportunity successfully move into a neighborhood that was previously the chaotic neighborhoods
Right.
that you talk about as being really negative influences? And if not, what do you see the challenges to doing that as being?
Right, so I am among the people who've spent most of my own attention and interest focused on mobility strategies, because I actually think the work it takes to transform neighborhoods in ways that don't just displace everybody who lived there before, that work is really hard. And I actually think we've learned more about how to succeed on the mobility side than we have learned about how to succeed on the neighborhood transformation side. So I think we have to keep trying on both. And I don't know, in my most optimistic moments, I think that the diversity, the increasing diversity of our whole population in the United States, and the increasing openness to diversity among the younger generation, and people's interest in living in diverse places may offer an opening going forward, that we can imagine having neighborhoods that have a mix of income levels and a mix of racial and ethnic groups and ages, without affluent white people running away from them. Yeah.
Associates. So I have a question about what the literature says about moves that are only somewhat better than where people started. And a quick context, and actually builds off of your question. So we absolutely should have a conversation about how we could help more people move from high poverty neighborhoods to the gold standard opportunity neighborhood that meets all 20 of John's characteristics. We should have that. We will have that conversation. But the reality is most people aren't going to make that kind of move. And we have a lot of changes going on in society, right? We have neighborhoods that are where a lot of wealthier people are moving back into cities, and we have a lot of suburban neighborhoods where poor people are moving into suburbs, right? And both of those provide opportunities to think about income mixing occurring more naturally, although probably more gradually and sort of less starker, right? But talking to Alan Ruby really focused me on, we have to think about how do we help keep moderate income families in suburbs when poor people move in, right? Just as much as we need to think about how do we keep poor people in cities when wealthier people move in.
Yeah.
But in both cases, we might achieve a little bit better, So what does the literature tell us? Is that a kind of improvement something that's worth fighting for, or should we only go for the gold standard from 40% poverty to 10%?
Well, two things, I think. First of all, the just basic results from moving to opportunity say that when you get out of those hideously distressed neighborhoods to a little bit better neighborhoods, better safety, people are much more positive about their neighborhood, and their physical and emotional health improves. So I think clearly the move from horrible to okay is well worth effort. And then I also think that my analysis shows that really every couple of percentage points of reduction in the poverty rate that you live in for an extended period of time is a plus, is a gain. I actually thought that there would be some stark effects where, well, let's see, what if we get them over this point or over this point? But the relationship that had power statistically, it was just the nice straight line, better and better. Lower and lower poverty rate, better and better. But I also agree with John that the smart way for programs to design the counseling they're providing is not to focus on a single indicator like poverty, but to focus on a constellation of indicators that reflect the opportunities we care about. And that's why I think we care especially about crime, and we care especially about school performance.
I don't know if calling them all three mechanisms helps more than it actually conceals, because they're three fundamentally different orders of phenomena to me. I mean, schools and services, those are intentionally designed, programmable, designable things that can be measured. Social networks and peer groups are largely self-generating, and we can create a structure to organize them, but not with the same level of predictability as we do schools. But crime and violence is fundamentally different. Sometimes we talk about it as if it's almost a fact of nature. It's one of these sort of super complex systems that's bigger, but it has been exceedingly difficult to subject itself to that same kind of intentional planning and control as those other things. So maybe separating those out and thinking about, well, what is the point of intervention in those three different realms might be a way, rather than thinking of those as three equivalent kinds of
That's a really good point, and I think it's especially important for the strand of work that's focused on how do we get the neighborhoods to perform better for the families who live in them. Right? I think you're right. My colleague Rolf Pendle makes another point that I think is kind of related that I really like, and that is that we all sort of talk about neighborhoods, but in fact, the scale of those mechanisms really varies. That the crime and violence could be really right in the development or on the block level that it matters the most, or on the walk to school that it matters the most. The school is an enrollment area, a school district, and I agree with you that social networks are a consequence in a lot of ways of these structural problems, but how we would intervene in social networks.
Well, and also those things are not limited to some sort of arbitrary designation of space.
Boundary,
In fact, they're much more free-flowing.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Just on the network, it's actually not as mysterious or organic as you suggested, Charles. I mean, there's a lot of work on network theory. But think about this. I was advising some students for graduate school, and they were looking at good graduate schools, but they're different networks, and they're very clear networks. So if you want to go to Wall Street, this is the school you go to. If you want to go to this, they're networks, and it's not that you get a fundamentally different education. It's that you get fundamentally different networks, and we can be much more deliberate about that. And there's a whole thing now about network knowledge, that people are saying knowledge is actually networks. And so it's not simply what Marge knows, what I know, it's what we know together. And as you may recall, there was a period where people thought telecommunication was going to be the wave of the future. It's not, this hasn't happened largely. And instead, you see people actually, I live in the Bay Area, people concentrating in the area because they're understanding that there's a knowledge network, and no matter how smart you are, you don't get by yourself. So people deliberately come to the Bay Area, pay those high costs of living, and companies locate there, even from places like Idaho, where there's, rent is free, because there's a, anyway, so I think that,
I'm moving there.
Let's all go with network.
Next comments.
But networks, I mean, we can have a long discussion this fall, but networks are bounded. And I think in some ways this whole idea of networks that are infinitely expandable or scale-free, sort of how do you actually go about creating those, and how do you get people actually into those, especially at a much younger age, not at the level of college, but at the level of primary school, middle school especially, and high school.
Well, there's one last story. My daughter, I have a daughter who has a serious disability. When we moved to Ohio, we were looking for schools, and most of the schools couldn't accommodate her. We found the school, and the school she went to in Bexley, some of you may know Ohio, the school has, this is, K through 12. Every child who goes to high school there graduates, and every child that graduates goes to college. And it's been true for years. And what the Black and Latino parents from Columbus do, They try to sneak their kids into the Bexley schools because they know if they get the kid into that school, they're home free. And my daughter, who has serious disability, she graduated and went to college, just like every other member of her cohorts. Whereas in Detroit, for black males, the graduation rate is around 23% from those who enter. So that's also a network. So I have family in Detroit. I say, you're not going to the Detroit public schools because knowing nothing else about the school or the student, if you go to that school, your chances of graduating, if you're male, is 23%.
There was a question there.
So I also wanted to jump in on some of the network questions. So I've been doing a study with some colleagues at Rand Corporation where we've been looking at Montgomery County where they have a really robust inclusionary zoning policy, and it creates a really nice natural experiment where some people live in clustered public housing, some people live in market rate housing that's zoning. The people are essentially the same, and the neighborhoods in Montgomery County are all universally quite wealthy. And doing a formal social network assessment, asking people, who do you know? What is it like? Did they go to college? Did they live in public housing? Do they own their own house? What's the health of those individuals? We find that there are differences, even in this kind of modest experiment that's there. That people who live in market rate housing tend to have higher socioeconomic status. People in their network, that higher socioeconomic status, that accrues over time, the length of time that people live there, and that is associated to a certain extent with people's own health and well-being. So I think even in these sort of modest experiments, that there's a potential for housing policy to impact the way that these social networks form.
Yes.
I have not a question, but I have a couple of comments. First, I absolutely must thank Barbara Samuels for making sure that I was sitting in this room. I am Carol Haney, the director of the HUD office for every jurisdiction in Maryland except Montgomery County. and Prince George's County, so either end of the spectrum. But what I want to say to the round table and to everyone that's sitting in this space, these conversations are so inspiring for me and so very important for me and the work that I try to do every day. My background is in maternal child health. So as I was sharing with John when I left Hopkins, after working many, many years trying to make sure we had safe delivery of healthy babies and healthy moms, and found myself at the infamous Flag House, not knowing that it was subsidized by HUD, then ended up at HUD and asking the question, what is this? How could families, how could children do well in this setting? And so for me, the question is, how do we translate the lessons of Thompson and mobility-assisted work to be the policy for families who need support in housing? I think that's the question for me. I'm not sure where the money comes from. I said to John, I would love to tell the secretary, redo your budget for 2015. Not that anyone would probably listen to him, but it is so important that we see this as the way in which we protect the viability of children going forward. And there has to be an urgency about doing it. Number one, and in Baltimore, it is a crisis, and we must do it. And so when Barbara arrived at my office, she met me very early. And when I said, Barbara Samuels is coming, everybody said, what? I said, yes, I'm so excited. I can't wait. So for me, and of course, I can't say enough about the mobility colleagues and all the folks that do this work in Baltimore. It is so important. And to the Urban Institute, my hat's off to Sue Hopkins,
Yes.
who is a very good colleague.
Thank you. I will tell her you said that. She is indeed.
So I thank you for allowing me to be here, and you will see me a lot.
And I wonder whether, so I think that all the things you said were a very clear and good analysis. And I wonder if sometimes in this moving discussion, we leave out factors of attaining stability and economic viability, not necessarily advancement, but that's a component of stability in a household. And I wonder if, I wonder whether what the trade-offs are. I know there's some public health findings that Section 8, that getting a housing voucher was like the only housing intervention that like had an effect in one of these big articles published in the journal.
So I think John said earlier, moving is disruptive, and it is a source of instability in a child's life, even if it is a move that the family has chosen and feels is going to be better for them. So there's no denying that there's going to be.
What about stability after?
Right. Okay. So stability after the move, I think, is one of the things we learned early on in the Moving to Opportunity demonstration, that a whole bunch of these families moved again in a year after that. The housing market was very hot in a lot of these markets at the time when the Moving to Opportunity demonstration was underway, and so we failed to help these families stay in the neighborhoods to which they moved. So not only did that they then have to endure the instability and the disruption of making additional moves, but they didn't get what we see are the benefits of staying in a better neighborhood for a longer period of time. So I really think that's one of the important, it doesn't get highlighted in the demonstration evaluation results, but it's an important lesson we learn, is that it's not just getting there, it's staying there. And one of the things I've said I admire so much about my colleagues who work in making mobility programs work is that they have watched this research go on around them and about them for years, and they keep learning from it and improving what they're doing. I think you were implementing really early lessons from MTO when you went back to Dallas right away. So, and this is a field of practice that has just been continuously improving itself. I admire it tremendously.
I was thinking about the program that I'll call it the design build progress, because we keep moving as we learn. But we worked with originally the first iteration of mobility counseling we did in this last organization situation I'm in, was to work with families who had made a mobility move. And we knew that they would probably relocate. The truth is that people who rent, particularly low-income people who rent with vouchers, it's stability, lovely as it sounds, and they don't expect, they end up having to move for all kinds of different reasons, sometimes in the course of their life. So our goal was to work with them to ensure that they didn't move back, that they didn't have to default because there was no support. So we really, that first 3 years of ICP's work was really working with the Walker Settlement voucher families, the special vouchers. So when people had to move, they knew that they didn't have to move back to a distressed neighborhood. And one of the things we found, certainly there were people who had to move, but the foreclosure crisis hit us just like everything, and so people had to move there. Families were okay with the move. They want to know, could they stay in the general same school district? The sort of helping people make an educated choice, realizing that there was some instability going to be involved in the thing. We didn't throw up our hands. And then it was really, I thought important. So it's not a perfect situation. You'd love for everybody to move into a stable house and stay there for, maybe their kids grow up there. That's not our clients' reality. So helping them make those kind of choices, and then once they've made a mobility move, either hold what they've got if they want to, or even move up.
I don't think I don't want to suggest that I have the most current literature on this question in the front of my brain. But again, thinking back to the early 90s when Ingrid, Ellen, and I were first looking at this literature, spatial mismatch was very much at the top of everybody's conversation. That jobs were suburbanizing. These neighborhoods that had at one point been very close to a lot of decent paying, moderate skill jobs were now isolated from employment opportunities. But I think one of the things that we've discovered from moving to opportunity is, first of all, that the low-wage labor market is very unstable. So low-skilled workers bounce around the labor market, and thinking that you're going to help them relocate to a place that is then close to a job they're going to stay in for a long time is sort of an unrealistic expectation. Zav Briggs did this ethnographic interviews and realized that these moms were juggling where do I work, where does my kids' child care happen, and where do I live? And all of those things could change at any moment, and they were taking the bus or transit in between those locations. So it turns out to be a much more complicated story than we thought it would be. So then the last thing I'll say is that my colleague Rolf Pendle is doing work including some analysis of the data from the Moving to Opportunity demonstration that suggests that low-income families with cars do a whole lot better on lots of outcomes. Now, this runs against everybody who's interested in public transportation and transit-oriented development and sustainability and global warming, but it's another dimension of choice. But the families with, and I mean, he is arguing there are many ways to get people affordable and reliable access to a car when they need it. Now, that not everybody has to own 2 cars in their garage to achieve this. But I think this is a direction worth exploring. Is cars appear to make a really big difference.
Well, I'm just curious, just to follow up, are there experiences, obviously this is where the tension with smart growth,
Yeah.
I think, tends to come in.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if there are examples where people have been able to engage there, because I know there are just times when smart growth people go, ah!
Yeah, so I think this, I mean, some of us have been in some conversations to bring the environmental sustainability, smart growth conversation together with this fair housing access to opportunity conversation. And it's tough. But I think there is an argument, I think, on the fair housing access to opportunity side that essentially privileged white people have been able to get cars and move where they want to. And so now we are going to say, oh, no, environmental sustainability, low-income people of color can't do that. It's problematic.
Marge, if I could just add one point, and maybe you could, one of the things that Marge touched on, but I think you could say more about is time. Time stress for long people is huge. They just don't have time. And that's what cars do. It actually gives them time. So some of the new measurements in terms of transportation is not looking at distance, it's looking at time. And you see that people spend a lot of time, so they don't have time, anyway.
Yep, and in fact, time was one of those 4 big resources that parents need to draw upon in order to support their kids.
That's also what we get from the community
Yeah.
to help with time.
Yes, yeah.
I'm Erin Boggs. I'm at a new organization called Open Communities Alliance, and on a personal level, my husband is a farmer, and they have a family farm that's all in environmental easement. So I'm very much aware of the sort of environmental side of all of this. But I've been thinking how the sort of that constituency could actually be brought into what we're trying to do, based on this notion that, why is sprawl happening? Because people left cities. Because it's because the cities became, because of housing policy and lots of other reasons, not a place we wanted to live. And that's now in Connecticut, that's happening at sort of the next level of inner ring suburbs, and really what that's gonna do is push people out even more and more and more. So can that be
Yeah,
something
I agree
that
with
helps
you,
us?
and I mean, this is an entire other 2-day conference. And I think some of us have tried to begin to make that argument, that real environmental sustainability in urban form isn't possible when it is, when you have this level of segregation, exclusion, and disparity. And so the definition of real sustainable development encompasses fair housing, access to opportunity, and equity. But going from that set of principles, which many people can sit around a table and nod about, to, okay, so what policies do you support and which ones do you try to change, is really hard, and we shouldn't, Frank, we shouldn't start it now.
Yeah, I was curious as we were talking, I think Betsy's comments, and just in terms of the mobility participants, this question of the instability and moving, and I'm wondering, even as we're seeing improvements relative to where they were in moving to the new places, to what extent are they the most unstable in the new environments as compared to others? And I'm wondering, because I'm thinking that like the homes that get foreclosed on are likely to be owned by middle class Black, or like the forces, they're more likely to be fired because they're or moved around a lot because of these forces of race and discrimination that were the original reason that had them isolated and segregated. And so it seems so that they are doing better relative to where they were, but that in some sense I'm wondering how they are doing relative to the other even low-income folks who are in that area and what extent that can be true.
So I don't think I have evidence on that. I think your point is right that poor people and poor people of color are the most affected by these structural forces of insecurity and instability across domains. So helping on the housing side by itself doesn't address the mess that the low-wage labor market is these days.
Well, and the other piece too is that when we see points of like, so for instance, when the housing market got high, and I thought you were saying, I'm not sure if you may have this, but that people were displaced.
Yes.
And so part of it is that, you know, the idea of the way in which, for instance, when you see gentrification or when you see development, the idea is to make the housing as expensive as possible, and there isn't still a place for renters.
Yeah.
There isn't still a place.
Yeah. But I think I'm anticipating that you may say something about counseling, providing some help, connecting to employment, addressing other forms of instability in a family's life. I think some of the mobility programs have tried to really enrich the services and the counseling to help families address all the different challenges they face. I think this is a really interesting and admirable direction to go with mobility counseling, but I want to come back to John's point, which is you can fall into a trap of going for the perfect and not putting in place a pretty good intervention.
Okay, and I just, in my point, I still think we should absolutely do it. My point was more that, like, I think it's also important as we talk about success and as we talk about prosperity, that we do keep these folks in the, like, what prosperity looks like isn't just for luxury housing. I think often when we see, like, I know in New York, the development looks a particular way, and so it's really important for us to, keep that as part of it, not to say that we shouldn't do it.
Gotcha.
Actually, I was
Sorry.
actually not going to talk about more counseling, because one of the ways we're dealing with that issue, I mean, let's say different, is as you push with mobility, it creates a demand. A demand has to be met with a supply. The supply, at a certain point in the market, we were able, actually, I think all of our foreclosures were white people in suburbs. And we just happened to know who our folks' landlords were. We bought 11 houses on this, not sort of, the idea was generated through the NSP program. We didn't end up doing that. Out of foreclosure in high opportunity areas, which Section 8 voucher holders. And that was sort of an experiment to see, okay, how cost effective is it to do that. We particularly bought 3 and 4 bedrooms because those are the ones that our families have the hardest time sometimes accessing. But then we sued the state over their administration of the tax credit program because the tax credit program, used right, can be an important part of an inventory, affordable housing inventory available to Section 8 families and other low-income families, particularly Section 8 families that face discrimination in places like Texas that don't have any kind of source of income protection. And in the higher opportunity, without defining that in the broadest way possible, and so it said, yeah, you've got to do it all, as I think Jim Ross said. But addressing this supply, once you start creating demand with a really robust mobility program that's not just boutique-y and not just experimental or anything like that, but where there's really no reason for every Section 8 program not to be something mobility program in terms of what the voucher makes somebody not housing poor. They ought to be able to access, if you do your advocacy right around the fair market rents, but you got to have the housing for them to get into. And if you don't have source of income protections, you've got to get it built. And the tax credit program is the program du jour, and it needs to go everywhere. And it needs to, because it can provide the stability, the housing program that you're talking about that provides a stable source of housing mixed into a market, a robust, healthy housing market otherwise, gives you that housing that people do not get bounced from. That, and all of our clients start off at least at 30% of area median and below. So that's one way to address it is to go ahead and look at what is, because it's always a chicken and the egg. If I had $1 for every time somebody said, oh, your clients don't really want to move, we don't really, we don't have the housing, John's, are we glad that they said they didn't want to come here? Yeah. We didn't really have the housing. But once they say they do, and once that starts, that sort of builds, then you've got to do your exclusionary zoning lawsuits, you've got to do your advocacy around the tax credit program, you've got to get cut on board to enforce the affirmatively furthering duty. So you've got to do it all, and the more but the mobility program puts extreme political pressure on a lot of systems that are very sacrosanct for a lot of people. And so once you start doing this, once you start creating this demand and telling people that they have a right to these opportunity structures and these opportunity communities, then you've got to be prepared to deal with that you're upsetting a lot. You're making a lot more unstable for a lot of people.
I'm not sure what I want to say. I want to make it clear that I could listen to John Powell and Marjorie Turner indefinitely. And then when you add in comments from Betsy and Barbara Sanders and so on, it's sort of like getting high.
We wouldn't know about that.
So I love this conversation, but I also loved the framing paper for this conference. I think the people who wrote that were just quite wonderful. They were thinking exactly right. And what they were saying, as I understand it from reading that, is that we know mobility works. We've been talking about how to tweak this and make it better. Marge is very astutely pointing out the great importance of staying in place. Maybe cars are more important than we have been focusing on. And in other ways, we can do even better what we have been doing all along. But what the framing paper says is that we know that this is saving kids, helping to get them out of harm's way. And we know why they're in harm's way because of the last decade, explosive decade of research on this subject. So the framing papers are saying, if our objective is, as it ought to be, to scale this stuff up, not to tweak it and figure out, not not to not do that, but that's not the focus of the conference, as I understand it. We really want to ask ourselves the question, if you take advantage of the recent research that tells us that bad neighborhoods kill kids, can we change the rhetoric, as the framing paper says, to a public health rather than an equal opportunity rhetoric? Is that going to help? Or that plus what else is going to enable us to take this thing that we know is working so importantly well and scale it up? And that's the question I hope to talk about tomorrow.
This has been wonderful. I
That's a
think
great
this is a
segue.
stopping point. Thank you, Alex.
And thank Marge.
Thank you, Mark.